to be enforceable. And so I guess my question is, so how do we know, for example, a right to food? What does that mean? A right to 2,000 calories a day? Does it mean a right to a balanced and healthy diet? We talk these days, ILO talks these days about decent work in general. Not just a job, but a decent job. A decent, safe and remunerative. So what is the process by which we go from economist discussions, like what's the poverty line, to something enforceable? And then, of course, when rights conflict, I mean, I have a right to something, I guess if I have a right to public support to pay for an unemployment insurance, that means I also have, in some indirect sense, a right that someone else pay taxes, pay. So that person then had a right to enjoy their income, but they cannot. They must pay it, so that there would be unemployment insurance. So maybe there's a lexicographic ordering somewhere in the universe of rights. And how do you find where they are? And how do you bring the economist discussion of rights into the legal framework?
Here's how I would, very important question, and really touches on a number of points you made earlier. I would respond by telling a story about the United States. We had a horrific depression in the 1930s, 29 to basically the war. So what, 11, 12 years more or less. We only overcame the massive unemployment, not so much by the government hiring program, although it made life better for a huge number of people, but what finally put the American people back to work was the war. We basically took half the unemployed and put them in a uniform and took the other half to make the uniform, and so everybody was working. But that meant that when the war was over, 1945, and demobilization of the army was begun, a fantastic anxiety, really interesting, swept across the United States, furthered by the death of Roosevelt and the trauma to the country because he was the most popular president. Little footnote, the president who engaged in a public employment program became the most popular president in American history, re-elected 4 times. No president had ever had that before. The current president is worried about his re-election, but doesn't ever raise the idea. Wonder what that's about. It was 1945. 1945, the war is over, and all those people in the army making uniforms aren't going to be in the army and aren't going to need uniforms. A tremendous anxiety about we're going to go back into the depression that the war temporarily got us out of. A movement developed, unions, Communist Party, strong at that time, Socialist Party, how to get this problem solved. And they descended on the language of rights. It is the right of the American people, all American adults, to have a job. And in the Employment Act of 1946, passed by the United States Congress, signed by the then President Truman, the initial wording of the law was, it is the obligation of the United States government to provide full employment as a right. In the final language, which had to be negotiated with the Republican Party, of course, 2 things were eliminated, at least as I understand the story. The word right was taken out, and instead of the word full employment, the word maximum was substituted. And that's the actual wording of the passed bill. That's the law that created the Council of Economic Advisors and a lot of other important institutions in this country. I think what a right is, if I can be so bold, is simply one way for a movement of people to try to establish deeper roots and a surer foundation for whatever it is they want at that time, for whatever the reasons are. That it has no mystical quality other than to try to give it as much force, as much power as much durability as they possibly can. And that, I don't mean to diminish it. If the word right adds power, force, and durability, that's a very important quality to have and means a struggle for rights if it works that way. As long as we don't forget that since that's what it is, if the political winds change, the right can be redefined right out of existence.
Let me just add one word to what Professor Wolff said, which I agree with. It was, again, a very eloquent statement. I think Barry Herman's question perhaps represents the weakness of rights discourse in recent years, not its strength. Your question, Barry, was about how the economists and the lawyers will reconcile their differences. One response would be, who cares? The only reason that they have to reconcile their differences is that it's in the context of the UN talking shops. You and I know that they're asked to reconcile their differences nowadays. Well, even now they're not really being asked to, because it's very much a sphere in which the lawyers rule. The lawyers, for many years in the international human rights context, have taken it as their preserve. And they've done a lot by way of norm development, by way of identifying specific criteria through which rights could be understood and a degree of enforceability, insofar as that's possible within the international legal context, could be promoted. But I think I agree with Professor Wolff that that's not the right focus for us. I think they will figure out how to reconcile their differences. And it's not at all difficult to imagine how. For example, on the question of how to define the poverty line, I don't think it's terribly interesting to ask whether there should be a calorific norm or some other conception of the norm. You and I can go into that, and in my view that these technical difficulties are quite easily resolved. The important question is, how do these ideas connect to the motivations that the broader public, which supports a rights discourse, have? And that's why it's important to understand that a right to food, for example, is a right to adequate food to live a full human life. The nutritionists and the economists and the philosophers and the lawyers can wrangle about specifics.
Okay, so in effect you're agreeing, it's just a political strategy.
I didn't say it's just a political strategy, but I'm trying to take...
I don't mind if it is just a political strategy.
I'm not saying that.
But the thing is, you should be able to enforce it through some political process. So the mechanism for deciding that there's some bad guy who has to be stopped because he's interfering with my right.
Well, there are trade-offs between rights. Right. So if someone believes that they have a right to all of the income which they earn in some fashion, which of course itself is a very it is something that isn't adequately defined until you go into what it means for a person to have produced the income which he or she earns, which is entirely non-trivial. But if someone believes that, and that therefore the IRS is not entitled to take any money from by way of federal taxes without infringing a right, then one is, and if you, for the moment, you want to concede that there is some limitation on the right, which indeed is to possess one's, to maintain control of one's own income, and that's involved in taxation. And I'm not sure you want to concede that, because again, the question of the baseline is non-trivial here. The baseline beyond which there is a taking, which is occurring. But suppose you concede that, then you are in a conceptual realm in which you're trading off rights, one against the other. And so what? Yes, of course you have to trade off certain rights. There's no conceptual embarrassment there, and there's no practical problem.
See, I'm not sure, I mean, I'm kind of playing devil's advocate, because I'm sympathetic to the rights discourse, but I actually don't see anything that it adds. Don't tell us.
I mean, the only thing I would say is...
Except political strategy.
Yeah, but if in the minds of a population, the concept of rights has a real meaning, it represents something more important than something that doesn't get called a right, then struggling for a right to be established is as politically significant as anything to be ever done. Or it moves something forward, it even gets another step. And And I think that's why conservative forces spend a lot of time undermining notions of the right of people to have this or that or the other, because they understand also that not challenging something's status as a right is according it a power and a social influence that they don't want it to have. And so they have to undermine. I mean, the clever ones with philosophical are going to go after the concept of right altogether, but most of them will just dispute the particular.
All right, well, thank you very much for everyone coming.